We are also heading into a year without a summer. The onset, if it follows historical recorded patterns, should be about 1 year to 1 year and 2 months after the eruption. So we have to go January 2022, and if we bring that out to January 2023, just this month, add another 2 months, and then we should get somewhere near the max cooling on that. And that shall roll, whatever effect that takes, is going to roll for another year and 7 months at these temperatures.
So you're saying that water vapor effect is going to kick in for the northern hemisphere roughly late spring, something like that?
Yes, right in our planting season.
Welcome to the feature interview for today. I'm Mike Adams, and our special guest today is David Dubine, and his channel is called Adapt 2030. He's also a host on Brighteon.tv every other Friday at 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern Time. That's a free stream to catch there. His channel, Adapt 2030, is also on Brighteon.com and other platforms. And he's also got the Mini Ice Age Conversations podcast. He's an analyst of global trends in food, fertilizer, crop production, and he has been calling it correctly for as long as I've known him. So, David Dubine, it's an honor to have you on. Thank you for joining me. This is going to be great.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. And I'm glad a few things played out last year that we talked about. I remember us having a talk back in March and how much of that came true. There were a few things that didn't hit, like the rationing cards, the digital rationing cards didn't come in full play. And just by the year end here of January 1st, identifying the trends and then definitely hitting a bunch of specifics.
Yeah.
What about the food supply in 2023? That's really what we want to talk about.
Well, that's true. But I do want to mention, just popped up in the news over the last day that in the UK, all the retailers, including food retailers, are using massive ID and surveillance tech tools now, and that is preparation for the food rationing that's coming. So, a lot of times you and I and others who can see pretty far in the future, we talk about these trends and we take a guess at a date. Sometimes it takes a little longer. Sometimes it happens a little sooner, but it's all moving in that direction. So you're nailing it.
You have to think about Whole Foods. They put that thing in where you have to scan your thumbprint before you're allowed in the gate. Where does that, drop in the definition of it?
Well, right. And clearly that's a pilot store. But here we are at the beginning of 2023, and people have already experienced food inflation on a huge scale. We don't have to convince anybody that food is more expensive, right? Everybody who eats has figured that out by now. Food scarcity here in the U.S., shelves aren't empty, obviously, but selection is reduced. There are shortages of certain things, like infant formula is still in shortage. There are supply chain problems. The main thrust of what I want to ask you about today is what you think the food supply situation is going to look like this year and next year. And then I want you to cover from your research some of the trends that lead you to those conclusions. So where would you begin?
If your New Year's resolutions revolve around weight loss, you're not alone. A recent survey reveals nearly half of Americans also picked eating healthier, exercising more, losing weight as their goal. One of the easiest ways I recommend jump-starting your New Year's resolution is with this amazing keto powder. I noticed a significant difference in my energy levels as well as appetite. I add it to my morning coffee before I head outside to do tasks around the farm or tea. It tastes great while keeping me a little more full between meals. Take 51% off your order by going to adaptwithketo.com. When you do order, you're going to get some special free bonuses. That's adaptwithketo.com, or click on that link in the description box below. And now on with the video. Well, I would start right back into the deindustrialization of Europe. That is ongoing and it has not ceased. And Mike, since you and I were talking to some of the same people telling us the smelters were going to close and there would be a full shuttering of all heavy industry across Europe, that has, past tense, already happened and has been months way in the past.
That's right.
Nothing's moving. Yeah. So we have no fertilizers, no herbicides, no pesticides, nothing coming out of Europe. And that was 40% of the world's production of fertilizer and all the other farm implements like insect control, competition species plants, otherwise known as weeds that you would kill off with herbicides. Every one of those factors that's in play in a field decreases the yields. When you start to look at the fertilizers, it's around a 0.8 to a 1-to-1 loss, depending how little you have of each of those. So even if you do simple math, minus 40% on the grain crops. And now we got Brazil going into a possible full civil war, and they're a huge, huge grain exporter. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, countries that are embroiled in a full civil war where their exports are functioning at full potential and the supply chains are running and everything is still working from the farm to the port, and the ports are loading and they're moving out on time. I just don't remember that in history. Maybe you do, but I don't.
No, they're headed into a very dangerous situation there. But I remember a recent headline where China is buying corn now directly from Brazil instead of purchasing it from the United States. So China seems to be creating global redundancy in their food supply chains, anticipating either shortages or conflict with the U.S., perhaps a trade war with the United States. So there are those implications as well. And I know we're going to talk about Ukraine and Russia and all of that, but grain exports out of Ukraine are going to factor into this year and next year for sure.
And then, the reason I was talking about Brazil and Argentina, wheat, this sort of thing, if you start to look at all the things that have happened just in the last, say, 1 month. So we're now having what's possibility of stoppages in Brazil. Argentina continues into its drought, so it's missing yet another plant and maturation season. That cold that swung down through the United States and North America was so cold that it killed winter wheat all the way down here in Tennessee. Replanting is going to be done. And I've seen here it's either brown or yellow out in the fields, and it was a pretty much complete loss. It hadn't really gone to dormancy here because, our season's a little bit different. Doesn't do that until January. I got hit with the cold. We got the Hunga Tonga eruption, which is a wild card, and I still can't believe nobody's talking about this. Largest watery vapor ejecta ever recorded, denting into crop production, and now that water vapor has eclipsed the equator and headed up to our North Pole. Now it envelops the entire planet. We are also heading into a year without a summer. The onset, if it follows historical recorded patterns, should be about 1 year to 1 year and 2 months after the eruption. So we have to go January 2022, and if we bring that out to January 2023, just this month, add another 2 months, and then we should get somewhere near the max cooling on that. And that shall roll, whatever effect that takes, is going to roll for another year and 7 months at these temperatures.
So you're saying that water vapor effect is going to kick in for the Northern Hemisphere roughly late spring, something like that?
Yes, right in our planting season. So, and I'm wondering how much this cool spell had to do with the year without a summer onsetting, because it's a bit strange. We get the coolest temperatures, in some places ever, and this water vapor was up there and following the same cycles of onsetting year without a summer in our spring planting season.
My question, though, David, is has anybody done the math on the volume of the water vapor that was dispersed into the mesosphere versus the cooling impact? Because there's a direct correlation, I know, but has anybody actually done that math? I mean, how do you estimate the cooling severity from that event?
On the Pinatubo eruption, the El Chinchon eruption, the Tambora eruption, and Mount Laki, that was in Iceland in the 1790s. Going back into these types of eruptions where they have very solid data on when it occurred and what the global impact or what the regional impacts were, that was so severe that populations had to migrate. It was seen with the Hunga Tonga eruption, sits in that somewhere depending on what's the measurements that they're using, looking through the optical aerosols to see what the density of aerosols are up there still. Mainly it's water vapor. There's still some sulfur dioxide, et cetera. And then, you covered on your show, they want to start doing some atmospheric perturbation, aerosol injections. What's that? Make Sunsets Company. Yeah. This is a runaway nightmare scenario. You start doing geoengineering, doing a year without a summer, and come clean. They've already been doing geoengineering for so many years. And David Keith, that was one of their main worries, was to put this program in play. And this is before, Make Sunsets. This stuff's been going on for years and years, this geoengineering. One of their nightmare scenarios was they had their program in full play, and then we got a VEI 7 or 8, and that would take 3 years to come out of the atmosphere. And they were concerned, is an understatement, about a runaway cooling event if those two were to overcouple.
The Make Sunsets Company, for those who aren't familiar, is a company that wants corporations to pay the Make Sunsets Company to pollute the atmosphere, to dim the sun in exchange for some kind of carbon credits. If this idea takes off, powerful corporations would funnel billions of dollars to a pro-pollution group that would pollute the skies for profit in the name of saving the planet, which is completely insane. But that's what this is. And the reason they call it make sunsets is because, if you dim the sun, you have more interesting sunsets because of all the redness and the orangeness and so on in the sky. But you also have global food crop failure and mass famine and death. So maybe making sunsets is not such a great idea.
Well, that's one of the markers that originally set me on this quest for looking at the water vapor data was what they call volcanic afterglow. Just days and weeks after the eruption in the southern hemisphere, the volcanic afterglow was already in the Antarctica. It was already southern New Zealand. It was already in southern parts of Australia, where people were talking about how vivid and how long-lasting and how purple these sunsets were. But you got to realize that eruption was at 20 south. Their viewing point was 40, 50 south. And, down to the Antarctic, that's at 90 degrees south. Right. That eruption, 20 degrees south latitude in Tonga, and it rolled down to the bottom of the planet and back up again. It's caused significant cooling, and it's called afterglow. Yeah, volcanic afterglow.
You talked about crop failures in the southern hemisphere because of the shorter growing seasons and the shortage of short season seeds. How much of that are we able to see in terms of data, or is it still too early because it's their season's not even over yet?
What's been known so far is the planting has been delayed in many places. The soil temperature and the moisture was just too much. There was nothing in there. They knew if they put seeds in, it wouldn't germinate, it would rot, and they would have to replant. So it's delayed planting in many a place across the southern hemisphere. But the lucky phase for them was after that eruption had happened, the onset cooling usually is a 12 to 14 month window where it hits the bottom. Like they'd come through the harvest season already during that window. Now we're entering the coolest from now. These next 2 months are going to be the bottom of the cooling, and you start to see it dropping. And if it any way is coming to a year without a summer, we are going to have the most brutal February. And the winter's going to hold on far longer because you've done some reports on this. They were talking about snow at the end of June and into July in the New York and New Hampshire and Vermont.
But right now, Europe is unusually warm, and we're seeing LNG prices falling, but that could be very temporary. And, it could be part of the weather temperature perturbations that happen, but they're getting a lucky couple of weeks here of warm weather.
Yeah, they are. And you have to think about, when would they start to riot and demand change? If it was as cold as it was here in North America, the United States, Canada, Mexico, if it was really that cold in Europe at that time, there would be riots and revolts on the streets already. At what point does it have to go? They are so blessed to have this warmth now that governments aren't being toppled by the minute because of people freezing in their homes, pipes busting, no basic services. Like that social contract that we have as obedience, not myself, but I'm just talking the general populace. The obedience is you give us a better way of life, a better possibility of life, and we will behave and obey the rule of law, pay the taxes, and do all the good things we will just to play the game so we have the opportunity. That's broken. And you throw in massive cold wave with no food, no heat, and expect people to continue to behave is just ludicrous. It gives them another couple days, weeks, or whatever to figure out what they have to do with the energy there. They don't have enough electric or natural gas to heat Europe in a normal winter. So where does that take us from now? There's no industry either.
Well, yeah, right. So joblessness is a huge problem there. But did you see that Germany's energy minister announced a couple of days ago that it's never going back to normal, that energy prices are going to stay elevated for as far as they can see? So anybody there who's maybe like, let's say a manufacturing business that's been holding on saying, well, we'll reopen when the electricity goes back to normal. It's not going back to normal there, Hans. It never. Your leaders just told you that. They're facing a very bleak decade, I would say.
Yeah, didn't I see up on Natural News that the German government was asking their citizens to take a shower only once a week?
True. Yeah.
Now,
Once
are
a
you
week.
telling me that one of the most apex societies on the planet is now degraded in less than a year and have fallen that far that they're burning firewood and they're asking their citizens to take a shower once a week? How fast it happened is shocking. It itself happening is shocking. Okay, that's a collapse of a civilization and an apex economy.
But
To drop that fast is shocking too.
that is true. I mean, the deindustrialization and now this hygiene factor, although me being satirical and politically incorrect, I had to joke and say for some parts of Europe, once a week would be an improvement. But but across the board, I get it. That's going to be a big problem for a lot of people, especially if the showers are cold. Like, oh, you can only shower once a week and it's a cold shower, like it's barely above freezing. That's not going to be any fun. So what are you going to do? Heat a bowl of water or a pot of water on a wood stove and then try to mix it with cold water and take like a lukewarm sponge bath out of a bucket? Is that what it's coming to? That's no fun either. I've done that, and that sucks. Not a good way to live.
Yeah, you could only embrace the Wim Hof method for a while before you get cold and you're like, well, that's enough of that. It's
Right.
the middle of winter in Germany. Yeah.
Right. Right. Yeah. The room in which you're bathing is also cold, like crazy cold. Just getting water on your skin makes you start to shiver. Not a good situation, but there's no end in sight to this. That's the thing. And even the governments are now admitting this. And I mean, and they're warning about the blackouts that are coming too across Europe, even in the UK, warning about blackouts or at least the potential for them. So I think that Europe is going to face a very, very difficult year. And in America, we've actually got it a lot better than the Europeans right now. Probably also on the food supply, wouldn't you say?
I would, because I have some new numbers. The agricultural minister of Ukraine, came out just about a week ago, just before the New Year onset, probably, like the 20th or somewhere around there of December of just last year, 2022, and said that they're only going to plant 30% of their field space due to damage from the war. And this would include shrapnel and unexploded ordnance, whatever had been parked in the field that has just stopped. Like imagine if you bring in a bunch of battle gear and it's just still on the field and everybody, and it moved to a different place, you have all that debris still there. They're having a very difficult time even considering planting 30%. So you know how it is. They start really rosy forecasts, but by the time it comes down to reality, it would not shock me if it was only 20% of all arable land in the Ukraine was planted this year. Because they've even had more strikes on their electrical infrastructure since that news report was put out some weeks and weeks ago.
Well, and the other factor is that there's apparently a major Russian offensive that is being planned and is almost certain to be carried out before the spring thaw of the ground. So imagine, tracked vehicles running across more fields, probably targeting Kiev and then moving westward from that if they succeed in taking Kiev. The breadbasket areas of Ukraine, of central Ukraine, are going to get hit with more combat and, more tracked vehicles, more ruts. I mean, I own tractors. You can't drive tractors across a field reliably if it's full of ruts and pits and mortar holes. You have to fix the field first. I mean, it's just physics.
If you ever watch this movie, it's titled King Corn, and it goes through the whole corn, ag industry here in the U.S. But they were saying that they would buy tracts of land from a farmer, and they would tear down the farmhouse because they didn't want to have to turn their tractors as much. So now you're telling me that they're tearing down old farmhouses because they don't want to go, turn their tractors on a 500-acre plot, but you're supposed to spin your little tractor around every mortar hole and bomb crater there and get a yield in?
Right.
Come on.
Yeah, that's not going to fly. Yeah, every crater is, heck, here in Texas, even just wild hogs digging up for wild onions, that causes enough damage to fields that it drives the local farmers totally bonkers. And if you're riding in a tractor over that land, you're in a roller coaster ride. It's like a shake and bake there on top of the tractor. You can barely drive the thing because you're getting rock and rolled all day long just from the hog holes. No.
You have to think about in Belarus and also Russia, the amount of nitrogen fertilizer that they export, as well as phosphorus as well. Like all of that's going to stop. So that's just going to continue to add into what Europe was not able to produce.
Right.
So then you have to think about the Belarusian potash that they mainly export. They got Himalayas of that stuff over there. And then, the Russia itself. Take all of that off the table in a cooling climate where, growing conditions are not going to be optimal anyway. And then how is that going to play out? I mean, you've grown crops before, I have too. And without the fertilizers or amendments or compost or whatever you're going to do, it just doesn't work as well. You can still get something. It's going to be scrappy yield. But, in reality, if we don't have 50% of the farm inputs for the world, then, what are the yields going to be is the question.
Yeah, absolutely. And then at least those inputs, typically a farmer can have some control over it. You might be able to get fertilizer if you're willing to pay 5 times as much, let's say. But there are things you can't control. And I want to ask you about this next, because this is what really concerns me, and it's geoengineering. It's weather weaponization. It's not just the cold wave that we just had, but then droughts and floods and heavy winds in storms that destroy orchards. Everything from avocado orchards in California to the citrus orchards in Florida. Just one windstorm, boom, and it's gone. And it takes a decade or many years, let's say, to recover from that. But the geoengineering seems to be cranking up like never before as well, and you can't control that. So I think the farmer's ability to project, with some degree of certainty, the crop yields is eroding rapidly. What are your thoughts?
Well, I would add to that the statement of the planted acreage in the forecast doesn't matter anymore. Because before, that's basically how they would gauge the forecast, is they had an average on the acreage, but you can't do that anymore if you don't have all the farm inputs. So it's not reliable. It's not going to be reliable. I would imagine it being more regional than it will be a countrywide market or a global market anymore, because the yields are going to be so varied and so different from continent to continent, state to state, even regions within the state. Here, East Tennessee or Central Tennessee, West Tennessee, it'll be very different even in those regions. So I just don't know how the market is going to continue to function to price it in. It'll probably move to a cash market in just a regional basis where, you're close to a place that's producing it, unless you're going to pay massive fees to move it somewhere. I don't know. There's going to be a breakdown in systems of how we price commodities, specifically grains. And then where's the knock on from that? I mean, that's just going to take down the rest of the system and the derivatives. And if you can't price an asset, and then there's other derivatives priced and based off of that asset, then everything down that daisy chain is corrupted and has to be revalued or, stranded and gone to zero, whatever way that might go.
Well, you've hit upon something that's really key here. Thank you for that segue into the financial system, because as you know, tools such as commodities futures, when they are used correctly, they are designed to reduce risk for a producer, right? So a farmer that grows wheat, he might buy wheat futures or sell wheat futures, depending on his financial goals. And in doing so, he could even out the risk of his crop failure, let's say. But when those tools are used by, let's say, speculators, or when derivatives are based on those tools, like you just mentioned, then the risk actually gets amplified, especially when those tools, those financial tools, are owned by individuals who are not actually part of the production chain. Thus, they're not farmers, but they're speculators or they're bankers, and then they're amplifying risk because they want higher rates of return. That kind of system can blow up, like the Big Short with housing. But we could have a commodities bubble burst or a commodities risk apocalypse that bleeds into the whole financial system. That's kind of what you were just describing, right?
And you could taper that on to silver as well. If you look, I know this financial might not go exactly with the grains, but I do believe they're intertwined because they're both commodities. Like at the COMEX over in London as well, the LBMA, they are running super thin on silver. They literally only have 5 months left of physical silver. So if we start to get the discontinuities of grain pricing going to cash versus what is offered on contract, and then the same thing happens where there's non-delivery because so much demand for silver and they literally can't get it out. I don't care if you're taking 1,000-ounce bars out or if you're going to get 10-ounce bars out. It does not matter. There won't be enough for anybody. And once that realization, you're going to watch the paper market's going to break from the physicals and people will bid and pay whatever they can to get that asset. It does not matter. And it'll move to all cash at that point.
Yeah,
So
that's a really good
contract
point.
pricing will mean nothing because nobody will abide by it.
Those contracts are often counterfeit anyway.
Yeah.
Like they don't represent real physical silver underneath the contract. It's just paper manipulation. But you're right. If people start demanding delivery on these options or futures contracts, then if enough people demand delivery, then the game is up because it exposes the fraud of the paper manipulation. Now, I don't know enough about other markets like copper or platinum or nickel or what have you, or iron, or I don't know how much of a similar manipulation is taking place in those markets, or even in grains or pork bellies or what have you. Are you aware of similar manipulations in other metals beyond silver and gold?
Well,
I mean,
I'm not really
nickel.
familiar. That's not really my wheelhouse. But,
No, I know.
at the grains, when it comes to do the same exact thing, when they want to take delivery and there is not enough there, we saw that happen with the nickel. And they
Yeah.
rolled back all those trades.
Yeah, the
The
London
physical
Metals
is not
Exchange
there
did
to
that, right?
facilitate the demand. So what happens when that's corn at this time or it's wheat and everybody wants it, but then there's going to be a realization date in time that you will remember for the rest of your life when they knew that there wasn't enough grain for everybody that wanted to buy it, and the frenzy that will cause, I tell you, that might be the very well thing that spills over and collapses the financial market. They'll need a distraction because when you're telling people on the globe, I'm sorry, we're not going to grow enough food, and we don't even have enough now to supply everybody who got money in their hand to come to buy it. I'm sorry.
Right.
Some of you are going to have to take a dramatic cut, and we're going to all world work together, equality. We'll all have to cut to 1,200 calories. Oh, you're not being inclusive. You're eating more. Oh, you're such a fill in the blank XYZ that we heard through the COVID time to, point fingers at the unprepared, hey, you guys are too prepared. You guys not fair.
Well, let me throw this into the mix and ask you a question along these lines. I've read financial reports recently that show that farming has actually been surprisingly profitable for those who can manage to produce in the United States over the last year. So we have an issue of inability to produce, creating scarcity because of supply chain, lack of parts for tractors, high diesel prices, transportation breakdowns with the barges and things like that. But for those farmers that did manage to produce, they actually got good prices this last year. And farmland itself has maintained value even as housing prices have been falling and as the real estate bubble is popping. But farmland, that is viable production farmland, is not falling in price. So wouldn't you say that farming, if you can actually get it done, could be a very viable and profitable business in 2023 and beyond?
I would, and I can add a little bit of information to that. I spoke at a dairy conference in October, and they spoke exactly about that. Farmers were flush with cash. Problem was they were going to get massive tax bills with that, so they were all running out to buy anything they could to then put that reinvestment back in so they didn't get taxed. So you have a choice. Okay, let's say your tax bill's 50,000 because you made millions off of your crops. You have a 50,000 US dollar tax bill. You can reinvest that in a new machine, or you can pay the government 50 grand and get nothing out of it. They were
Right.
cash rich. They were running out to buy anything and everything they could just to get rid of the cash so they didn't have the tax liability to it. And
Yeah, sure.
moving to marginal lands, like some, you're talking about prime land is what you're describing there,
Yes.
prime farmland with the high yields on the acre there. But it seems that there's a frenzy for leases on marginal land. So what you're talking about, if you got the holes in there and the ruts, you're going to have to come in and at least work those fields to get them up to some production. But the world we're moving into, some production is better than none. You can't expect 190 bushels per acre. That's what they did last year. The USDA got it so wrong that they ended up in the 150s. So if we're going to take that as a benchmark at 150 bushels per acre as the new high, they'll be happy to get 40 to 50 bushels off a marginal acre because the prices are expected to go so high that some is better than none because they're going to move to cash pricing.
Mm-hmm.
When this rift occurs of, price discovery on a contract versus cash, it's happening. It was so close with the delivery last year. I think it's poised for 2023.
Okay. All right. That makes sense. Now, another thought in all of this is that farmers that fail to be able to plant crops, often on marginal land that you were just talking about, they could still run cattle on that land because, of course, the cattle do their own foraging, and the cattle can walk around ruts and erosion or craters or what have you, right? They do their own thing. I could see a lot of situations where farmers, maybe they can't grow alfalfa this year or soybeans or corn, but they might run cattle for a season or two, and at least in the United States. But in Europe, of course, they have a war against livestock because of the nitrogen output from the urine. So in Europe, they don't even have that option in many places now, like the Netherlands, where they're shutting down thousands of farms. So they're taking away one more option from a farmer.